All right, welcome back, everyone. We hope you had a good break and took all the time that you needed to rest and recharge for this next upcoming panel. My name is Stacy. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a member of Asian Solidarity Collective. For visual purposes, I'm a light-skinned Asian Filipina person. I have green hair in two buns at the top of my head, and I'm wearing black frame glasses and a plaid shirt. So we are excited to introduce I'm sorry, let me add the ASL interpreter. Thank you, Stephanie. So we are so excited to bring on the next panel of the summit, Asian Americans and the Journey to Abolition. Before we begin, we would like to give a special thanks to our accessibility coordinator, Melissa Kelly Colibri, pronouns they and them, and our ASL interpreter for the panel, Stephanie Chow, pronouns she and her. Thank you so much for being here. So our moderator for this panel is Josen Diaz. Josen Masangkay Diaz, pronouns she, her, and they and them, is a student and teacher of race, gender, colonialism, and authoritarianism. She is an assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of San Diego, and Josen is also a founding core member of ASC. So Josen, take it away, and I'll let you introduce the panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stacy, for that introduction. So I'm really excited to moderate this panel today. There's some really great folks that I'm excited to learn from. So I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists first, and then we'll bring them on and hear more from them. So unfortunately, Suparna Khadija is one of the wonderful core members of ASC who won't be able to make it today, unfortunately, but we're looking forward to learning more from her and elevating her work in the near future. So one of our panelists, AT Furuya, who uses they, them pronouns, lives on Kumeyaay land. They are a trans, agender, queer, Japanese American organizer. The majority of their focus is in helping LGBTQ plus youth access basic life necessities and also opportunities to thrive. They build, act, struggle, and grow within a transformative justice framework, meaning they believe in accountability as care, and they believe in prison abolition. AT and their partner, Dominic, have a bunny named Mina and are full-time caregivers for Auntie Joy, a living legend. Sarath Suong uses he and him pronouns. He was born in Khao Dang refugee camp after his family fled Cambodia's civil war. They resettled in his hometown of Revere, Massachusetts, where he learned about community organizing as a working class queer refugee. Sarath is the national director of Southeast Asian Freedom Network, a movement family of Southeast Asian grassroots organizations united to fight for abolition. So thank you both, AT and Sarath, for joining us here today. So I'll go ahead and start, and I want to hear more about both of you and just your work. So my question here today is just, how did you all arrive at abolitionist work? Either AT or Sarath. To start.
Okay, I can jump in. All right. So hi, thank you for the welcome, and happy to be here. Especially, the Asian Solidarity Collective has been really much needed space in San Diego, and so I just appreciate all the work that everyone's put into making this weekend happen. So how did I get involved in abolitionist work? About 8 years ago, I was trying to leave. And so, content warning, I feel like talking about abolition and especially like transformative justice in any way, there's going to be heavy mentions of different experiences. So I'm going to be talking about specifically domestic violence, not in detail, but I will be mentioning that. And so about 80 years ago, I was trying to leave an abusive relationship. I did not know how, and I really just felt stuck and conflicted. I just started reading The Revolution Starts at Home which is an anthology edited by Leila Lakshmi and Chingen Chen and Jai Dulani. This was this like left me feeling, oh gosh, like what do I do? And I want like to embody a lot of the things discussed in resolution, solution. I just felt I was at a point in my activism where I hadn't thought about what this system means to people in my community. And so yeah, this was the first time I'd learned about the concept of getting to the root of a problem instead of like addressing one action or moment. And in just learning about transformative justice and not knowing many others at the time, when it was time for me to leave the relationship I was in, I was like, what do I do? Do I file a police report to keep him away from me? Could this potentially put another queer brown person in jail? So what else can I do? And I didn't have the resources in San Diego. There was a group of us who had started the Makikua project, which was a queer and trans BIPOC org. But we were all really like trying to figure out, there just wasn't enough of us. Like there wasn't the kind of support that was needed. And I ended up filing a restraining order and I went to court. And while my safety was the priority, like in the end, I did not feel safer, nor did I feel that I received justice of any type. Like it didn't make me feel good to do all of those things. And when someone, a close friend of mine asked, like, what would you have needed to feel safer and to feel justice? And I said, transformation. Like I need change. I want to know that this person is not going to continue being harmful. And I will also say that like, nowhere in that time did I feel safe around the police. The safety that I felt was when I was surrounded by community members who I knew were looking out for me, who I knew were listening to my story. And that changed, I think, how I moved forward in thinking about organizing. And so I was going to all these TJ workshops. I was looking at my life and how like my organizing skills, who I, as a mentor to young people, what was I doing in my own practices at the youth drop-in center that we were running? How was I reevaluating our own like boundaries and like if a student violated that, like were we just kicking them out or were we, you know, what was the process? And so that's where I've like continued on that road to today. And that's really like how I got here, was that first moment of how am I safe? And then how am I keeping my people safe? And I think at the root of it, this like idea growing up as a kid that the police, that the system, that going to prison was gonna somehow rehabilitate people, like, and then the harsh reality as, you know, an adult that no, that's not going to happen. And no, I've never experienced that, but I've just been fed those words all the time without necessarily a specific example to an alternative. And then not realizing I have the power to dream what that alternative is myself. Like I never thought that I could think of and I could build and create what that alternative is too. I never felt I had that kind of power. So that's what led me to where I am and my involvement and just kind of my own realization and growth over time.
Thank you so much. Sarath?
Thank you. Thank you, folks, for the invitation. Thank you, AT, for sharing. I really appreciate you sharing your story. Yeah, so hey, everybody. Sarath here. Based in beautiful the Ocean State, the smallest state, the biggest heart, I say, here in Rhode Island, or Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Pakanoka territory. But thank you for having me here today. So how did I arrive to abolition? I feel like this is such an interesting question. You know, I think for me, I think I was born into abolitionist work, and I'll explain that. I was born in the, you know, like Josen said in my intro, I was born in the biggest refugee camp that during the Vietnam War. I mean, we called it here the Vietnam War, but we called over there the American War, right? The wars in Southeast Asia. And and so my parents, after the U.S. destabilized, messed up our countries, rained bombs on us, left. There was a communist coup in Cambodia, which resulted in a genocide. And my parents, hundreds of thousands of others, fled to the nearby Thai borders to seek refuge in camps. And I was born in the camps. And my parents talked to me about how I was born, just kicking and screaming, and just never stopped screaming. And they said, and then we eventually resettled in Boston, Massachusetts, where I was raised. And growing up as a queer, poor refugee, Khmer refugee, refugee from Cambodia, especially in the 80s and 90s, in a city like Boston was really hard. So if you think about it, right, we sort of we came at the perfect storm at that time in this country, around the war on drugs, around the Clinton administration building more, expanding prisons. Private prisons were growing, the police was growing, the idea of the super predator was growing, and so we came at a really, I think, unique time where we came at a moment where all that was happening. We were a reminder of a war that the U.S. wanted to forget, right? And I think for us, we were brought to the U.S. as part of the largest refugee resettlement program in U.S. history, which included over 1.4 million folks from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And like I was saying, the U.S. promised to resettle us through the refugee resettlement program of 1980, and stabilize us, but instead they abandoned us, right? And so we were sort of we were resettled in under-resourced, over-policed neighborhoods with failing schools, with high racial profiling. And that was sort of the reality for me growing up. And so that meant that I saw the police beat up my neighbors, right? That meant that I saw the school system pushing out my peers and my siblings. That meant that waking up at 13 years old to walk to school to know that there was 4 houses of refugee families that were burnt down the night before because of arson. And that meant that at the age of 13, my best friend was killed by the police. And so for me, it was really, I was trying to understand and make sense of who we were and why we were here in this country. And my older siblings and my family were too traumatized with their journey here to talk about it. So I remember being a young, really frustrated, really angry young person, and I walked into a community center, and they sort of took me in, and they said, they taught me 2 really important lessons. They said that everything that was happening to us, that it was not our fault. I think as growing up Buddhist, I thought, oh, it's karma, maybe we did something, but no, they said it's not our fault. And more importantly, they said that there are larger systems at play. And then as I began to learn about things like U.S. military, like war, like capitalism, like racism, and then they also taught me that if we join together, if we build community, that if we love each other and support one another, and if we sort of organize and we come together and that we can really change the material conditions of what we're living in. And I was like, oh wow, that's one way. That's the way that I want to channel all my rage and anger and frustration. And so I think that sort of, and I talk about that because that's sort of my entry into community organizing, right? And through community organizing, I was able to put into practice and into language and into my heart about, like, what are we organizing for? That if what we're saying as Southeast Asians is that the U.S. military is the biggest perpetrator of violence in our lives, and the reasons why we became refugees in the first place, then it is our responsibility and duty to dismantle the U.S. military to help stop the creation of refugees like us. And that sort of led me in my personal and political development trajectory into thinking more about this idea about what abolition can look like. What would a world without government-sanctioned violence, without a police system, without prisons, without war, without military, without borders, what could that look like? And as a community that is entangled so much within this broken immigration system, within this really messed up criminal legal system, my organizing has, and my lived experience shaped my idea about my sort of passion for what abolition can look like, and really sort of, I think, base a lot of my work and my life's work into a world, towards working towards that world.
Oh, I appreciate both of you all, those answers, especially. I think one of the things I'm hearing, especially, are the, I do think that, which is great, like folks are coming into abolition as a sort of newer movement. But I think what both AT and Sarath, you both are saying, is that it's always been here. But Sarath, the way you put it, right, you're born into abolition, and both of you have kind of discussed the ways that you all grapple with and fight against the violence, state violence, kind of the violence of everyday experience, through the materiality of your lives, right? Like it's something that you experience intimately and something that you believe in individually. So, related to that, I wonder, you both are organizers and have organized various places throughout your lives. What ways do you all practice abolitionist principles in your own organizing? And we can start with AT. I think you mentioned this also in San Diego with the Makikua Project, working with youth. But what ways do you practice these abolitionist principles in your organizing?
So it's not easy. It's like really hard, because I'm like constantly shedding ideas about punishment and false fantasies that the system will protect me, and that every day I'm like, oh, where did that come from? Like, oh shit, like I didn't realize that I was holding myself back or holding other people back by certain behaviors or ideas that I thought were the way, right? How I've been conditioned. And so I feel like every day it's like, okay, what can I shed today that has been planted in my mind as a young person that I still need to get rid of? And so I think for me, like the practicing like abolitionist principles is, how am I showing up in my everyday? Like how am I everything, like, and I believe that the transformative justice framework is about accountability and reflection, and not responding with further violence or relying on the state. And so when I think about that, it's like, how does this very large and complicated idea of transformative justice and abolition work, like how do I bring that in on a smaller scale to me as an individual? So I think that's number one. And then how, like, I don't want to go to work and say like, oh, well, this is my job, right? Like this is what we do. And then when I leave work, I'm this like fighting for abolition. Like, how do I bring and incorporate my values into my job? And if my job does not allow me to do that, then as hard as it is, I have to start looking for another job. And so I have to also evaluate, like, where am I compromising? What harm is that compromising doing? And what can I do to work towards shifting that compromise to not be like, all right, well, it's not that big of a harm. Like, how do I just continue? And I think that diligence is like permeating out into everything that I'm trying to be involved in. I think it's also the trust building. I think that's a huge part of it. In order to help folks change, there has to be trust. I think of like Miriam Kaba, who is anytime I can listen to her speak, I try to, because I just learned so much. But something that she said too is like, think of a time when you transform, when you changed your behavior, and who is involved in that. And it's always been with people I trusted. And so when we build that trust and we show up for each other as a community, I think it allows us to believe that accountability and holding each other to that accountability is an act of love, not just for the person who's been harmed, but for the person who caused harm and for everyone else. And so I think it's shifting the framework. And so how am I, and I shared this with the ASC group a couple weeks ago. So another practice is I used to, like, I'm really good at calling people out. Like, I'm really good at it. Like, I am so good at making a post and slamming people and being like, you know, I am not saying this is not, it's a conflict. Like, I struggle because I'm like, I want justice and I want like this, you know, I want this person to pay. And I'm like, oh, that's punishment. I want this person punished in my immediate feelings. And so I'm constantly navigating, like, how does my voice get heard? How do I not recreate violence? And violence could be isolation, like isolating someone who's harmed. And yeah, we don't want them to harm other people, but they're not going to transform and heal and not harm others by isolating. And those are like ideas of prison, right? Like, we may not be sending people to prison, but we're sending them to social prison, community prison, if you will. And that's by cutting them off of all supplies and resources to help them actually transform. So I'm in constant conflict with, if it's a person, if it's an organization. I mean, I think it's not black and white, right? Like, there's some politicians or elected officials that need to be called out. And so I think it's like addressing behavior, shifting from labeling people as rapists, as abusers, but saying like they, you know, people's behaviors have been, because I think that as hard as it is, and it does not feel good when I hear someone defending someone who harmed in a way that's like, they need to transform too. And I'm like, I feel really uncomfortable right now. Like, I've got to sit with this discomfort because right now, like, again, what's been ingrained in me is punishment. This person needs to be on trial. They need to, you know, and so I think about community, especially, and I talk a lot about community members because I think I just have over the years, including myself, have seen folks invested in this work fuck up once and they're out, right? Like, there's no redemption, there's no reintroduction, there's no, we don't even allow them the opportunity to reflect on what they've done and be different. And I think that is where we need to rethink, even in the difficulties. And if you're someone who's like, no, I will not give them the opportunity, that's okay, right? Like, that's all right. And so what I've learned, because like, I have removed myself from that process. I do not need to be part of that, that holding a person accountable, because I'm not in a space to do it. My heart is not there. I have punishment on my heart, and I have hurt on my heart, and that's what I want for that person. So I've got to be honest. I need to remove myself. I'm not part of this situation, and then to allow others who do have that space to let that to make sure that person help that person not continue harm, let them grow into their practice, let them grow into holding that space, because I think the other part in my own self-reflection, and I'm a Virgo, so I'm also like, I've got answers for everything, is my answers aren't always right, ouch. And then two, that I shouldn't be in everything. I think when folks become leaders in a certain communities, there's like the go-to, there's an issue, go to that person. And for me, I like to feel needed. I like to feel a part of something. And I had to come to the realization that I am not the person to always do stuff. I'm not always the voice. I'm not always the representation. I'm not always the accountability partner. And so, like, also reflecting in what is appropriate, where is appropriate for you to do your work and to be present. So I know that that's not like, you know, it's maybe it's not a different approach. I think abolitionist work is not just like hardcore streamed into like these boxes. And I think the parts that what I'm sharing right now are the areas that I'm focusing on. And that's, as it was mentioned, community, like having the community folks that you're connected to. And I think the constant conversation, let's learn about TJ work, and let's learn about transformative justice. Let's learn about community safety. Let's learn about intervention that doesn't involve the state. And right now, like those are the things I have capacity to do. And so that's what I'm focusing on. And then I support other folks that are doing work too, it's like, I don't have the knowledge yet. I don't have the space, but like I can financially support, or I can sign on to things, or I can show up to an event. So those are just some of, it's like I have my core practice, and then I have my support practice, and that's where I'm so if you think of like the pods, right? That's kind of how I organize and think about what am I engaging in today? How am I teaching young people to, how am I like looking for alternatives for them to like not go into the military industrial complex to further harm and genocide across seas. It's like, and that was a huge, I think that created a lot of conflict too, when it was like trans people couldn't join the military and everyone's up in arms, and that's not my battle. I don't believe in fighting for trans people to join a system that is occupying and harming people across in other countries. And so that's not something that I choose to fight for. That's not the representation I want. That's not the representation we need. So I'm going to focus my concerns and work and practice elsewhere. So I think it's like, how do I make those disruptions? How do I, if students feel like, the military targets poor BIPOC students, poor people in general, and all across the country, and especially BIPOC folks. And if folks feel like the military is the only thing they have to get out of a terrible situation, how do we provide those resources so that's not what they're turning to? And I think that's the same with like people wanting to join the police force. Like, oh, I don't have a degree, but I can go to police school for 2 months and become a cop. Like, how do we find alternatives for folks to not feel like that's what they have to turn to in order to be legitimate in our society or to get basic life needs? So, and I know that there's a lot of organizations doing this work in schools as well to make sure that young people aren't we disrupt that streamline, right? That pipeline into creating future oppressors.
Thanks so much. Sarath?
Thanks, AT, for talking about the pipeline, because I was actually going to go into a little bit about that as well. I really appreciate you, AT, bringing your work and stuff, and I want to say that that's really, like, please keep doing that work, and I want to reach out actually, because I need those trainings and those conversations myself. So for me, I think my experience around practicing abolitionist principle is really around organizing, right? Which is to say, I'm not an expert in it. I'm learning about it every single day. And I'm also trying to like practice it in my personal life as well. But I want to talk a little bit about how it shows up in organizing and in movement work. So I think it's okay. I'm trying to figure out how to explain this well. Let me just say this. I think that for me, I want to think about abolition and in the sort of the movement sense is that we're dismantling the current systems, right, that don't serve us, and actually more than don't serve us, that really harm us and harm others, right? Police, prisons, military, borders, nations, and to really think about rebuilding, like, right? So rebuilding about new systems and new ways of being, right? Of relating to one another that is based on like safety and dignity, and making sure that we all have room to grow and to love and to be ourselves, right? And it's, and I see abolition as more of a journey than anything, And as a journey that we all must collectively agree to walk together, to travel together. And then so, but I think in terms of organizing, in terms of like work and campaigns and organizations, it's hard to practice abolitionist principles if we're organizing under the nonprofit industrial complex in a racial capitalist system like the US. So let me just say that, right? That it's near impossible. Now, I think that there are things that we can do to actively sort of like work against that. But at the end of the day, I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can organize our way out of abolition, especially if this, especially if we think about funds and capitalism and how that moves our organizations and movements and campaigns. But anyways, I shouldn't be saying that as a national director, but it's okay. But I think that that's part of the reality. So there's some things that we could do, right? I think there's always tension around like, okay, the abolitionists. I mean, also I want to say that this conversation that we're having is new, and that we're having a conversation. But abolitionists and abolition isn't new, right? Thank you so much to the many decades of hard work that Black liberators have done to really sort of open up these opportunities and the national imagination around, what abolition can look like, right? And so, for me, I think when I think about policy or campaigns or projects that are moved towards abolition, I think about like at the end goal of it, like, is it really taking a brick away, right, from prisons and from the borders, or is it just making it stronger, right? I mean, sometimes it feels really hard to like be able to like spend years and years of work just take one little tiny brick away from that humongous wall, right? But we do it because, like I said, for me, it's part of the journey, right? It's the community we build, the skills that we build, the love that we generate in the community towards taking that small brick away. So let me give an example. So for in Providence, in Rhode Island, I'm a co-founder and a recent former director of an organization called Providence Youth Student Movement, or PRISM, and we were founded in 2001 to sort of to organize Southeast Asian young people, queer and trans youth of color, and who we call survivors of state violence, to fight back against state violence. And our first campaign was around dismantling the gang database, right? Because we knew then that the Providence Police Department was started a gang unit in the gang database in the early 80s to survey and profile and put Southeast Asian young people into this gang database, the secret gang database, right? Just from walking down the street, hanging out with their friends or going to school, take pictures, stop them to get their phone numbers and their names, put them into this database. The danger in that, as most of us know, is that, if a young person gets put to trial, if there's any connection to a gang, they get enhanced sentencing, right? So that's part of the school to prison to deportation pipeline, right? So we said we got to dismantle that, right? And so then, around the same time, when we were starting to sort of work around that, we heard that the U.S. had forced Cambodia to accept back folks with deportation orders, right? Which was like another crisis in the community. And so then it was clear to us, okay, we gotta really organize. We gotta build a local, national, and international movement against deportation. And in Providence, we were, after about 10 years, we were able to pass through a lot of work. It was so much work. We were able to pass one of the most comprehensive racial profiling legislation in the country to this day, called the Community Safety Act. And it's this beautiful, like, piece of legislation that didn't dismantle the police or defund the police really, but like sort of did things like, the police had to give a ticket or a reason why they stopped anybody. It gave protections around like sort of gender expression, gender identity, and for us and for PRISM at that time was really important that it actually provided an appeal process, and a way to sort of start chipping away at the gang database, right? But then while we were doing that work, it was about maybe 6-7 years of work while we were doing that, we also know that policy isn't going to save us. We can pass all the laws we want, right? But at the end of the day, like who's going to really save us is ourselves. And so while we were doing that campaign work, we were also building a cop watch in our neighborhoods, right? We were like, okay, we're going to try to pass this legislation. That's the like sexy public news stuff, right? But on the back end and in the communities and in the streets, we're going to do neighborhood patrols on our own. We're going to document, right? And we're going to build really strong legal and emotional and financial support resources for our community members who constantly on the daily get harassed and brutalized by the police. But that stuff doesn't really get a lot of attention, right? But that's the stuff that we were working just as hard, if not even harder than the public campaign. And so that's one of the principles, I think, was like really being clear about what is our campaign, what is the work that we're doing, like what is the institutional change that we want to do, right? But then at the same time, not just resting on that we actually have to create also the cultural shifts within our communities, and that we actually have to do the defense work ourselves to protect ourselves from state violence, right? And so all that was like sort of like we would sort of imagine, we didn't think about this what we were doing, but we were imagining a new way of being in our new neighborhoods and our communities, a new way of protecting each other. We were redefining what safety meant for us, and that meant us protecting each other. And so I want to connect it then to sort of like the larger anti-deportation movement that I'm a part of with SEAFN, Southeast Asian Freedom Network. I've had the honor in the past year to become the national director. And we're a movement family of grassroots local organizing groups that are based in Southeast Asian communities. And we came together 20 years ago to create a united front against the deportation of Cambodians, right? 20 years later, deportations are still happening, but we've been able to keep so many folks off those planes. We've been able to return back a handful of folks, and we're not going to stop until the people have the opportunity to be back with their loved ones. And so the past couple of years, trying to think about who we are and what we're doing, we know that it was clear for us that we want to end the deportation of Southeast Asian refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And then as we were thinking about it more, we said, like, is that really our end goal, right? I mean, we can't, what are we going to do after, we're going to win, right? We're going to stop the deportation of people. What do we do after that? And so that got us thinking a little bit more about then, like, what is beyond that, right? And what does it mean for us? What does it mean for us to be thinking about who we are as refugees? What does that mean for if we can understand that we are displaced people and displaced folks, people who are displaced by the U.S. military, right, on stolen land that was built by Black slaves, right? Then for us, it's really imperative that we join the effort to open the prisons, fight for Black liberation, and give back the land, right? Like that's sort of like our goal. And then folks are like, okay, wow, well, that makes sense. And then it sort of aligned perfectly with other comrades and folks that we were thinking about what abolition could look like as a movement of folks. So also, just quickly, while we were doing the anti-deportation work, we also learned clearly that we actually needed to also do that with a more intersectional and particularly a gender justice and queer liberation lens. That as we are working, the folks who rose up to fight back against the deportation crisis in the community were and are queer, women, femme, trans Southeast Asian folks working to defend cis, male, Southeast Asian men. And part of part of how we're expanding that work and that vision is to also knowing that having experience and trauma that for the past 20 years many of us had to endure struggle, right, and had to endure like assault and like homophobia, transphobia, and sexual assault, right, from our community members, from our loved ones who were broken by the system and in turn try to break us. But we had to be principled in that struggle and lean in to say that we have to stop these sort of like cycles that you're in, and we have to really work together. And so we're trying our hardest to figure out what RJ and TJ could look like in the anti-deportation movement, knowing that we are working with folks who've been totally broken by the system, but also knowing that we ourselves have been broken by the movement as well. But knowing that we're committed to have a principled struggle together to end deportation for our communities, but really end deportation for all. Yeah. Josen, I think you're muted. I think you're still muted, Josen.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, you all. Am I back? Okay? I apologize. Okay, we're back. So what I was saying is that what I think you both are showing us and modeling for us are things that Black abolitionists have been showing us for decades, right? Is around creative and collective genius. That I think, especially for both of you, what both of you are showing is that there are the answers around reform are just not, they're not it, right? They're not it, and there's other models and other means that we need to do to keep ourselves safe and keep ourselves powerful, right? So in the last sort of bit for our panel here, the last question I have for you all, and I think you all have gestured towards this, is and Dylan Rodriguez has mentioned this as well in his opening Q&A, is as calls for anti-hate crime legislation are ramping up, how can Asian Americans support the calls and work for abolition? And I guess another way to ask this, right, is where does Asian American organizing and abolition intersect? And we'll go ahead and have that be our last question, if you all want to speak on that.
Sure. Yeah, and I just want to say that, like, listening to Sarath speak and thinking about so I'm not like finished taking in what you just really beautifully shared, and I'm thinking of Afghanistan, and the people are on my heart as well. I think we're seeing really horrific scenes of how the U.S. continues to fuck up, and then we just don't take care of the U.S. is in serious need of some TJ love. Okay, so, but I think in regards to the call for anti-hate crime legislation as it's ramping up, and I spoke about this before on another panel for ASC, and always my concern is, okay, so the government wants to protect Asian people because there's like some violence that's happening against us. And then my first question that comes up is, how is this going to impact our community? What these Asian anti-hate crimes are really doing is it's expanding the police departments. They're creating larger patrol units in our neighborhoods, and it's always mind-blowing to me when people are like, well, you don't see people in like La Jolla getting arrested, and it's like, yeah, and how many police stations do they have in La Jolla that are constantly driving up and down the street? Like, if you look for trouble, you're gonna find it. If you look for any kind of I have a goal. When you have your goals set, you're gonna meet them when you have so much power at your fingertips. And so I think of the last thing our community needs is more ICE agents, like looking into our communities, more police looking into our communities. It's actually further than what we need. And so I think there's this like false narrative that is trying to like, well, let's make sure folks feel safe. So as an elected official, I'm going to vote for this because I care for you. And especially when people are like, but hey, what about this? And I think of my grandparents. I'm a caretaker for Auntie Joy, the living legend. She truly is. She was born in a U.S. prison camp. She was born in 1942 while the U.S. imprisoned Japanese Americans during World War II. My grandparents lost everything. They were told to pack up what they can carry, boarded on trains with no windows. Everything was covered and taken out to the desert to live. And when people started questioning the government, initially it was like, well, we can't trust Japanese people. They're spies and they're not really U.S. citizens, and they're not like this loyalty question came into play. But then the message that they were sending out to the rest of the country was, well, we also want to keep them safe. That's what Japanese people were then told. We're putting you here for your own safety because we can't control. Everyone else wants to harm you. So the best thing to do is to put you here locked away with guns pointed at you. And so I think when I hear any type of legislation come up, the first thing I think of is my family's trauma and history of having everything they built for taken away. Within a week, having to move to an environment that they had no idea, never been to, middle of the desert with no resources that they could create for their own, and so I don't have that trust that my benefit, my safety, and is at the core of these bills. So that's the first thing is I question, like, how is this going to impact here's the message we're receiving. What is the reality? And then what we can do is ask those questions and then get involved. I think, again, we need trust. We need to build that trust amongst each other. We need to have interpersonal relationships. If we want to be there when we're feeling hurt and harmed, we have to have that connection. And so I'm thinking of like how ASC, for example, like getting involved with Asian Solidarity Collective as one example, because we're here on this panel and celebrating the amazing work that's happened, is to think about like what this organization has created, which is community. It's created educational resources and tools. It's created mutual aid. It's like, and has engaged in other organizations' mutual aid. So I'm thinking of like what ASC to me feels like is moving towards that alternative too. So if something goes down, I know folks I can turn to say, hey, I'm struggling right now. I need support. And I know I'm going to get it from people who have values that are aligned with mine. And so I think that's what's key. I think it's being around people invested in this work. Like, I didn't just wake up one day and say, I want to work towards abolition. Like, people invested in me. And if we're investing in other people that I'm thinking of like my political views. I have radically transformed from the person I was as a young person because people invested in me and taught me so much. Everything that I share is not my own. I didn't just create it and think of it myself. It was, as Sarath has said, it's because of Black abolitionists. It's because of the Black women leaders, Black trans women leaders, Black cisgender women leaders in my life, the people before me. And I think of how, again, model minority myth created to actually separate me from the very people who are helping me liberate myself and who I can then turn around and help in solidarity to liberate. Like, we're, the folks who are the most impacted by the history of this country and our systems are the very ones who've been the key to us unlocking what liberation can look like. And we absolutely cannot do this work in isolation. We cannot say, well, I'm not Black, so I'm not going to focus on their support. I've got to focus on my own people. That's all of us, right? And our liberations and our struggles are interconnected. You cannot deny that. And so I think of how do we get involved and how do we continue making those connections? And for folks, like myself, sometimes I'm like super introverted and I'm like, I don't want to go in a room and talk to a bunch of folks. And then I'm like, oh, We have text messaging, thanks to disability justice and the deaf community. We have like all of these tools to really help keep us connected, no matter how people want to judge them, in ways that have always been created by people who've been left out. And so we have a lot to thank to those folks, and we have a lot we owe them, to continue investing in the people that are so-called undesirables, to the people that we continue, like we as in society continue to leave out of resources and leadership positions, and think that they're like, I'm thinking I was too much for people. Like, I'm trans, I got all, I've got all this stuff that I'm working through, and I'm just too much. And someone was like, you're not too much, and we deserve your too much. And I was like, wow, I had never heard that framing before. And it was so healing, to know that I was worthy of investment. And like, I get emotional thinking about that, because like, I'm with my people, right? Like, if you're on this call and you're in these spaces, and I'm listening to like personal stories being shared over the day, and I'm like, it's worth investing in this space and in this movement, because we deserve it. That's all.
Thank you, AT. Okay, so much to say about this. Let's see. I think like these, I'm trying to think about sort of like this anti-Asian hate moment, and how we could, and like how we could really turn into movements, right? Like, how do we connect it to current movements? And so, so like sort of in this past year, or I mean, even during like sort of start of COVID, right? Like when it was like sort of more talked about the anti-Asian hate stuff, I began to see that there was like clearly like organizations have different viewpoints, when it comes to like, some are recommending responses to, when people are recommending responses to the hate violence. There was ones who, for want more hate crimes framework to address, that they really want to rely on the police to document, investigate, and prosecute, right, on these acts of violence. And on the other hand, there's also been great to see that there are many Asian folks and Asian organizations who recommend a more transformative justice model, right, that really seeks to like limit and disentangle law enforcement from sort of these like sort of acts of harm. I'm really worried that our alliance and hate crime legislation, to like Asian Americans and Asian American organizations, and to call for more sentencing, which to me means more prison time, which means more prison beds, which means more prison guards, which means corporations get richer, etc. We know that. And that in this moment of racial reckoning, and in this current moment of anti-Asian violence, I want to believe that we as Asian Americans can dig a lot deeper, and think about how we respond, and like, I want to ask us about how do we rely on structures that's always going to choose us over Black and Indigenous folks. It's always going to do that, right? And how we try harder, and I hope that we're kind of doing now, like folks like ASC and this panel and this conference, that we can find solutions to help build a better world, right? I think about what happens, when we rely on the system, rely on hate crime legislation, that what happens when what happens when law enforcement and lawmakers are themselves white supremacists, right? I mean, BLM has taught us this, and have shown the rotten core of policing and prisons in the US, of how these systems actually work to uphold racial capitalism. And Asian Americans, that we're closer, that we like, that we're always going to get chosen over these folks. And that BLM has also taught us that while we work towards community solutions for abolition, we actually have to also contend with law and legislation and policy in order to provide some relief for some harm reduction, right? So please check out things like the Breathe Act. It's really beautiful, and it lays out a policy pathway forward for us. They also taught us that we can create policy and legislation that moves us towards abolition, like defund police campaigns happening across the country. And I believe that if we give everyone the resources they need to thrive, that we all need to thrive, that there will be less harm done to one another, and that there'll be more openness to building racial love and solidarity, and that, really ultimately that white supremacy can be abolished and vanquished. I also know that we as Asian Americans, we know that our communities have practiced models of accountability and addressed hurt and harm, before the advent of police and prisons here in the U.S. and before our communities came into the U.S. I want us to dig a little bit deeper and find those models and traditions and practice them again. So that's sort of me, what I just really want for us Asian Americans to really contend with this in this moment. Because I think that we have to, as a movement, really, and as a community, really need to get it together, like really figure these contradictions out, and be on the right side of justice. Last thing I want to say is, I think there is a danger in sort of, for me, hate crime legislation, call for more policing and stuff. That's a symptom of the rising of an even more powerful neoliberalism in this country. And I really want us as Asian Americans to like sort of be aware of that and move ourselves away from that, right? So one quick thing is like, when we saw all the stuff that was happening around Afghanistan this past week, one, it was triggering as heck for like Southeast Asian folks, to sort of watch all the videos and photos and to hear all the comparisons to Vietnam and all that happened there. And I've been seeing a lot of responses being to accept refugees, you have to accept refugees. And I think one abolitionist way of thinking about it is to, and I know that, me and SEAFN are thinking about it, is that we have to say it's not enough to just accept refugees, these refugees. You accept them all, right? But we can't just accept them and put them into the same conditions that will set them up for deportation 25 years later. Those young, those young kids and children that are in those planes, that in this are the same ones that the U.S. is going to deport in 25 and 30 years. I know that because that happened to Southeast Asians. That's happening to Southeast Asians. And so we don't change the conditions in where we're bringing refugees to, then we're just recycling, right? And we're just building stronger this racial capitalist system the U.S. has. And so I say, accept refugees, but also just defund the U.S. military and dismantle the U.S. military and get the U.S. military out of countries, and stop making refugees like Southeast Asians, like those Afghani refugees that we're seeing.
You all, we're at time. Just so much appreciation for you, AT, for you, Sarath, for your work, for your presence today, for just building. Really looking forward to continuing to build with you all through ASC. So much gratitude for Stephanie. Thank you so much for the tremendous work to make this panel accessible. Really appreciative. So I'm just going to continue to kind of process what you all are saying and turn it over to the organizers. But thank you all so much.
Wow. It's gonna take me a while to get over that. What a panel. I think if there are other ASC members here, I think you know that we cry really easily and often. So thank you all for sharing such beautiful words. Can we put some hearts and hand claps in the chat for these folks? Thank you for sharing your too much with us and for reminding us to channel our anger and frustration and to hold each other in close relationship and be willing to transform. I have learned so much by being in community with other members of ASC, and I appreciate everything that this organization and that you folks have given me and all of us here today. I hope everyone is feeling this grounding of support that our panelists have offered us today. So our next event is going to begin at 11:40 in the sessions room, and you're not going to want to miss that. For a little bit of instructions on how to find the session, on the side panel of the Hopin platform you're currently in, you should see an icon with the word sessions, which you can click on to enter a session area that is currently happening. You can also enter through the reception area to see the full summit schedule for the day. And we've got a lot of good stuff happening today. The next panel that's coming up is we'll be learning from parent and community organizers from Police Free LAUSD, who have so much to celebrate and to teach us. And so we'll see you over in the session soon. Thanks all.